Welcome to the Brave Feminine Leadership podcast. I'm Melissa Hamilton. I'm a former global CEO, company director, and these days I spend my time thinking deeply about influence and leadership and what actually moves people. I've led organisations with more than 5,000 people globally, and over the last few years I've interviewed over 250 leaders, leading CEOs, company chairs and academics. And one thing became clear: the strategic imperative of people leadership has never been more critical. And that's why today I'm in conversation with chief people leaders. The CPO function has fundamentally shifted. It's no longer a support function, it's strategic. And these leaders sit at the centre of leadership culture and long-term performance with a unique view of how executives are shaped over time. So today I'm curious about Shomaice Zowghi's journey, about the moments that shaped how she leads and what she's navigating right now as she helps build an organisation fit for what's coming next. Shomaice, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Let me share your bio with the audience. So for people who haven't come across Shomaice before, Shomaice Zowghi is a senior people and culture executive and employment lawyer with over 15 years experience leading workforce strategy, industrial relations and organisational transformation across complex, highly unionised environments. She is currently head of people at Pacific National, Australia's largest private rail freight operator. Showmace, so looking forward to our conversation. Let's kick off by just me asking you, who are you as a human being? So take me back to how did you find your way into this role? And maybe what parts of the journey might make sense now that didn't at the time?
Thanks, Melissa. I'm a child of two immigrant parents who left Iran in the 70s and they migrated to the UK and then Australia. And I was born in Sydney and I went through the public school system. I'm told I was quite an argumentative child, so it wasn't a surprise to anyone when I studied journalism and law at the University of New South Wales. And I was really blessed to have incredibly supportive parents, sibling, grandparents, aunties, uncles, and cousins who all believed in the transformative power of education, who believed in gender equality, who strived for excellence and engaged in a lot of community service. And I know not everyone has those cheerleaders, so I've always been very grateful for my good fortune. And so with that influence, I've always been someone who cares deeply about fairness, about dignity and social justice, and how people are experiencing the world. And I spent quite a bit of my youth doing a lot of volunteer work and community service within that social justice space. I didn't really come to HR through a traditional path. I came into it through being an employment and safety lawyer at the start, and then also through my lived experience. As an intersectional woman, there were definitely moments in my career where I didn't feel like I belonged, and there were absolutely times when I either saw or I experienced bullying, harassment, and discrimination, and times when my own mental health and often those around me was really impacted negatively by behaviours at work. And that left a mark, and it made it very clear to me that I just didn't want anyone else to have those experiences at work. So initially, my motivation was quite simple. I just wanted to improve the employee experience and create environments and teams where people felt safe, empowered, and healthy so they could do their best work. Because I think those are, the conditions for high performance. But over time, I realized if I really want to change that employee experience at scale, I needed to be inside that system to influence how decisions were being made. And I'm not saying you have to be in a leadership role necessarily to influence change, because I've seen really positive impacts of grassroots movements. But for me, my idea was to try and, be in the room where it happens and bring my lens to that table. And so I sort of traveled from commercial law and alternative dispute resolution to employment law. And then I left the law firms altogether and I went in-house. And that's where I went deeper into industrial relations and human resources and ultimately leadership roles, because that's where you can actually shift outcomes and not just respond to them after the fact and clean up a mess. And that's especially the case, I think, with industrial relations. It's often framed as this really polarized space between unions and employers, and everyone gets really ideological and entrenched in those positions. But the reality is, on both sides of that equation, there are people who care deeply about positive outcomes for employees. And if you can work constructively together to approach things from an interest-based perspective, I think you can actually really help people navigate the real complexities in life, whether that's flexibility or the cost of living or illness and injuries or dealing with domestic violence or gender transition or just the vicissitudes of life that impact the workplace.
Mm.
And honestly, it was very tough at times in my career, especially when I became the first female director of industrial relations in a 107-year-old passenger railway system in New South Wales. That was probably a turning point for me because historically that space was very male dominated. Deals were done at the pub, and it was very much secret men's industrial business and very closed network. And I remember thinking, I don't look or act or sound like what this role has always been. And how on earth am I going to survive this? But I had an absolute crack team, and we were the wind beneath each other's wings. And with the support of my family and friends, and also the right mentors and sponsors on both the employer and the union side, because I had them on both sides, I was able to carve out a place for myself in that system. And I had the right people around me, people who watched over me and championed me in rooms that I wasn't in. And I'm always conscious that's a debt that I need to pay forward. Now I lead a broader team in the private sector in rail freight, and I'm looking after HR, workplace relations, and learning and development. And I will say it's been really valuable to work across both the private and the public sector because they've each taught me different but important things. And now looking back in hindsight and reflecting with you, whilst a lot of these steps were sort of accidental or by osmosis, it does make sense now. And I can see that these experiences have each in their own way shaped how I lead, particularly those challenging and dark ones, because those are the ones that forced me to be brave and resilient and find my voice, and particularly to navigate really complex power structures and try and lift other people up with me while I'm doing that.
What an astonishing career you've already had. And I can only imagine what the future's going to hold as well. But can I take you back for a minute? Because I just loved what you said then about the mentors and sponsors you had on kind of both sides of the team. And I love also the point you made around two sides when you're negotiating the industrial space, and the fact that often those two sides are saying the same thing but can't hear each other. But I just would love to understand if you can take us back for a minute to that point. How did what were the instincts you had to find those mentors and sponsors on both sides? How did you kind of engage them, if you like, to get the support you needed at a time when, as you said yourself, you looked around and thought, gosh, I don't really belong here. How did you go through that?
I think some of those people found me.
Yeah.
And then I think I tried to sort of adopt a posture of learning from those people and to spend time with them and listen, actively listen and watch what they were doing, particularly in executive settings, um, and just kind of learning by observing, but also making sure I was building in time in my daily activities to have those conversations. Um, but honestly, a lot of them found me, and many of them were not at all in my demographic and had a completely different experience of life. But I think if you can just be open and relate to a wide range of people and be curious about people that have completely different walk of life from you, you'll kind of find your tribe organically, I think, but you just kind of have to be on the lookout and be open to it.
And find the wisdom that other people have got. Do you still nurture those relationships today?
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really lucky. And I'm still in the similar industry that I was in my previous role. So absolutely, I still have those connections and I make sure that I build space into my life to catch up with people for a lunch or a drink or a coffee and touch base and also to do that for others as well, because I've always promised myself that if I was able to get into leadership positions, that I would try and help people that, like me, didn't know what they were doing and didn't fit in, to try and just um, pay that forward.
So you've made that shift into people and culture well and truly. What do you think's the most misunderstood thing about the role or the function?
I think probably the biggest misconception is the one you've been touching on in this series, which is that people and culture is still a support function and that HR should be transactional audit takers or policy enforcers or just the cleanup crew.
Mm.
And when you look at organizations today, actually, the biggest drivers of performance and risk sit in the workforce. And often, I see business strategies fail not because the idea was wrong, but just because the organization didn't have the capability or the leadership or the change management maturity or indeed the culture to execute it. And those are all elements where HR can add enormous strategic value. And I'm lucky I work with the right executives who have that evolved understanding of the role. Otherwise, you can very easily get relegated back to a transactional space. And particularly in the heavy industries that I've worked in, all the biggest risks are people related, leadership behavior, psychosocial safety, industrial relations. They're all critical make or break issues central to the business's success. And ultimately, I guess the other misconception is that people think humans are resources, and I don't think humans are resources. I think the shift from HR to people and culture, or some companies are calling it people and capability, is symbolic of something deeper. It's moving from being management's henchman to a trusted strategic business partner. And I also think it's not a field of work for people who lack empathy or hate the workforce. Because if you don't genuinely care about the employee experience, you're not going to build a culture that performs, and you actually have no business being a CPO.
Mm. I love that. At what point did you realize, and it may well be before you joined it, but at what point did you realize this role could shape outcomes, not just support them?
I think probably for me it was when I moved from advising on issues as a lawyer, or an advisor to trying to shape the environment that created the issues. And as I moved into leadership roles, probably in HR and industrial relations, where you start to design structures or negotiate big enterprise agreements or run sort of change and transformation processes, or even working in diversity and inclusion, that's where I think you realize you're not just responding to problems, although there's always going to be some of that work, but you also have the opportunity to try and influence whether the problem happens at all. And so I think a true strategic CPO is really like a workforce architect, and they should be thinking about what capabilities do we need in the future for the workforce? Do we build or automate or buy those capabilities? And how fast can my organization respond to change that's happening to us? And what risks are inside my workforce, especially around psychosocial? And also, like, what is the employee experience and how can I optimize it? So, your old approach, very reactive, very service oriented, but the modern CPO should be spending time on these proactive elements and having a seat at the table in strategic discussions. But as I said, you can't make fetch happen without executive support. Your CEO and your board need to want a strategic CPO, and I'm lucky that my current organization does.
So I just want to pause for a minute because I think you said this to me the other day and I was curious about it. You just made an observation that you think a lot of people misunderstand psychosocial. Tell me about that.
Um, I guess, there's been a lot of legislative changes around this type of risk, driven by the Commonwealth and the state safety regulator. And so now we have pretty clear guidelines that talk about what organizations and leaders need to do to manage psychosocial risk. And, it's things that go through the whole employee life cycle. It's things around role clarity, upholding organizational justice, ensuring there's proper reward and recognition systems, ensuring that your complaints management process is something that's trusted by employees and that there is action when risks are raised. And so I think this is not something new, but the regulator has a little bit more emphasis on it right now. And towards the end of last year, we saw the first safety prosecution, which is a very sad case involving the Department of Defense. And it really clearly demonstrated that leaders are the first line of defense, and their ability to lead with care and empathy in the operationalization of people policies is going to be critical to their success. And so in the past, we haven't necessarily seen those sort of outcomes. So now our laws have teeth, and the Commonwealth regulator is demonstrating that they're going to use those teeth. So I think it's an issue that all organizations are grappling with at the moment of how do we bring together all the right people to effectively manage this risk in a dynamic way.
So, okay, when we talk then about strategic and all of the change that's coming at us so quickly, and I love some of the things you said about just the ability to assess is the organisation change ready and capable and how fast and all those sorts of things. But my question is, how do you keep yourself relevant and across all of the broad strategic considerations around future of work and everything that impacts the business?
It's definitely a daily struggle, but for me, it's about having one foot in the internal world of my organization and that microcosm, and one in the external world out there. So on one hand, I'm trying to make sure I'm understanding what's in my external environment, whether it's AI or tech, ways of working. I try and connect with service providers to see what the latest products are they have with my peers, following geopolitical instability and looking at the impact of the cost of living on our people, especially lately in a time of war. You know, my legal background means I'm always watching regulatory changes closely and thinking about what are they going to mean for how we work, and looking at industry changes and what our competitors are up to. And of course, you know, listening to podcasts like this, going to events and conferences and making time to catch up with my network and my mentors and those sponsors. And then the other foot, I'm trying to stay connected to the lived experience of my own team and also the workforce. So going to operational sites, actually speaking to people and having a yarn about what's on their mind, what are the big issues. When I start new jobs, I always try and do like a day in the life of experience and do a full shift with different employees. I think that's a great practice I learned from some of my operational mentors in the railways, and the importance of those vignettes and understanding what people are experiencing in reality to contextualize data that you might see in a boardroom. That can't be underestimated. And sometimes I also do like mystery shopper activities, like I test our people systems or our EAP to see what the user experience is. I think my mom, who you know, who's a leading world expert in human-centered design, has been a big influence on me because she's always instilled in me to put the human at the center of every problem that you're trying to solve.
Amazing. So I view the people function and often the CPO role as one that is, to be effective is really a master at influence and stakeholder management. And so when I think about that, do you view that as a strength? Do you use that as a strength? How did you have to learn that? And I'd love us to lean into culture as well, because I know for you, we really talked about trust as a foundation of all of that. So I just love in that mix to understand, how are you shaping leaders who are capable and confident in this world?
I think you're absolutely right, with influence and trust being really critical. I think trust is built through showing up consistently, transparently, and demonstrating positive leadership behaviors and modeling them yourself, and also rewarding them where you see them and calling out where you don't see them. And I think that's also where, psychological safety comes in. Um, it requires, though, a paradigm shift from managing performance through control to actually leading through care, empathy, clarity, and accountability. Because I don't think people perform at their best in an environment where they feel unsafe. And as I've said, there are compliance issues around that as well. So for me, it's when you're building that leadership talent pipeline to ensure that those are the qualities that you're looking for, people that can lead through consistency and transparency and demonstrate the positive leadership behaviors, and in programs that you're building to support emerging leaders, that those are the types of elements that you're including. Um, yeah, those probably are my key thoughts about that.
I've stretched this group by asking, when you look ahead to 2040, what capability do you think will separate effective executives? And some people have mulled on 2040, some have said, wow, that's a long way away, but actually it's not. Um, what do we think is going to be the things that is going to have people really standing out? And I guess my question is, how are you thinking about starting to shape leaders to build that capability?
Yeah, look, it's a really tough question because things just seem to be moving so fast lately. And I think by 2040, who knows? But the defining capability, I think that will continue and will still be relevant then is the ability to lead through constant disruption and uncertainty, but without losing the trust of your people. Because I
Mm,
think we've moved into a state of permanent instability in the world between like global uncertainty and shifting workplace expectations and AI and the rising cost of living. So I think the leaders that will stand out in the now and in the future will be the ones that can drive change quickly while keeping people engaged and safe. Um, what I sometimes see is one or the other, either leaders who deliver amazing outcomes, but they completely destroy trust and culture, or leaders who create really great environments, but they avoid all the hard decisions. Um, and I think the future and probably even the present requires both. So
mm,
I'll be focusing in terms of leadership capability uplift on leaders that communicate with clarity, lead with care and empathy, not ego and fear, and have the courage to make difficult calls, but safely. And also leaders who can think critically without AI, because I see a danger in people's over dependence on AI to do their thinking. Um,
mm,
so, and my partner works in the university sector, and she sees it all the time around, you know, that critical thinking element being eroded through over reliance on large language models.
mm. That's so fascinating about how we're going to nurture people to retain critical thinking in that space. It brings me to ask you around the AI strategy for your organization and how close are you to it, or how close are the people leaders in your business to it?
Um, right now, my team and I are absolutely involved in using it ourselves. Obviously things like Copilot or things we've integrated into our people systems like Power BI. I guess more broadly, the rail industry is an industry where technology has to be introduced through sustainable step change and also in tandem with a much broader and complex network because our assets are built to last 50 years.
Mm,
And it's obviously heavily industrialized. There's obligations around consultation, but we do partner with the business to develop use cases and find problems that we actually wanted to solve. And I guess in that regard, I wholeheartedly agree with my mum's views around not adopting AI for the sake of it and to be really mindful that of it can scale harm, it strengthens biases, it can cause privacy breaches, it hallucinates, it
mm,
can trigger really ill-conceived automation cascades and create safety issues. So I'm absolutely in favor of using AI within ethical boundaries and also, as my mom says, purpose-built, task-specific, context-sensitive. So, for example, I'd love to see some solutions developed by some of our service providers in the market using AI around risk assessment for psychological risk or psychosocial risk so that we do have that more dynamic form of risk assessment tool rather than a static document containing a point in time assessment.
mm. So very much, and I hear that, and I was so lucky to speak to your mum last year, which was amazing. But just it's the purpose element, isn't it? It's the solving a problem element that sits at the heart of it, rather than just using it for the sake of using it. So if I
Absolutely.
circle back then to leadership potential where we were, what do you think gets mistaken for leadership potential?
I love this question, and there's a couple of things at the top of my list. So, first of all, unbridled confidence and hastiness. Often loud, visible confidence is mistaken for capability, but I think what we should be paying attention to is judgment, self-awareness, ability to influence outcomes, ability to assess risk before you act, critical thinking, but also empathy and how you make people feel. And I've seen very confident and hasty leaders create a lot of damage because they didn't look before they stepped. And I'm thinking the classic sort of egotistical head cutter comes in, decimates the team, trashes everyone's ideas. And it's not until later everyone fully realizes the consequences. So I think that more thoughtful and considerate leader drives more positive outcomes.
Mm.
And I guess in that regard, I think there's value in doing psychological testing for leaders of large workforces to ensure that they have empathy. And then the other one for me would be technical mastery with no desire to lead. It's better to focus on people that have a desire to lead. And there's a reason when HR teams do talent mapping that they have individual contributor as a separate group to the leadership box, because some people are amazing at their role. They might be making the organization a truckload of money. It does not mean they want to lead people, or they should. And we shouldn't be forcing those people or encouraging them to step up, because you're just dressing up mutton as lamb. And
Mm.
I'm not saying individual contributors can't develop into leaders. Of course they can. I'm just saying there has to be a desire to want to lead others and to unlearn maladaptive behaviors like micromanaging. And often, what somebody used to get to a particular point of success is not what will make them successful at the next level up. I've had to unlearn a whole bunch of unhealthy lawyer behaviors in order to
Tell us,
lead
tell us,
teams.
tell us more, Shomaice.
Oh, look, I have a rule for myself now where I only make substantive edits, not stylistic ones. Nobody needs you to get out your red pen.
Oh, I love that. Yes. So yeah, I mean, how demoralizing is it to
Yes,
get
it
something
is.
back
Yes,
that,
it is. But when that's all you're taught and that's all you experience as a junior lawyer, it's very easy to continue along that path and accept what is familiar. But you
yeah.
actually have to stop and unlearn behaviors that aren't helpful.
How did you learn that? Were you self-aware or did someone give you feedback?
Both.
Yeah.
I was conscious of what I was experiencing in my own body when it was done to me, but also I did 360 reviews where I spammed everyone and asked for feedback. I think you have to just not be an emotional hemophiliac. You have to take that feedback and listen to those difficult things and actually change things, or you won't grow.
Can I ask you, like, absolutely question without notice, but if you had to think about the hardest piece of feedback you've had in your career, can you think about what that would be?
Yeah, I think probably feedback around that, me externalizing the anxiety and stress that I felt myself was impacting the people around me,
Mm,
and to learn to control that and emotionally regulate myself more effectively so that my anxiety wasn't being contagious.
mm. How fabulous. And was that one of the mentors that you had worked with that shared that with you?
Oh, someone in my own team was
Oh,
my
I love that.
2IC. Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think you have to create space for people in your team to be able to say that to you. I don't surround myself with sycophants. I surround myself with people that are going to tell me I'm carrying on like a pork chop because that's what I want.
I love that. So when you encounter, often you're leading change in the sort of role that you're in, right? So, and often you will encounter resistance to that change, human nature. But what tells you whether it's something to kind of work through or around, or have you had any lessons yourself on pushing too fast or waiting too long?
Yeah, I mean, I've encountered a lot of resistance to change working in the roles I have, and I sort of try and discern between, is the resistance a sign of a real risk that I need to actually unpack and address, or is it fear and misinformation that I need to like work through and take people on a journey? In terms of lessons I've learned doing, especially these big transformation projects across government, is the things that cause backlash most often is not doing proper planning and due diligence, not doing your effective stakeholder and change management, um, not having a cohesive narrative for why you actually need this change. And there's always going to be some winners or losers with some changes, but at least have your what's in it for me statement clear. And these days in Australia, there's a smorgasbord of options for employees and their representatives across safety and employment law to slow down or just kibosh your change. So
Mm.
you need to plan quite carefully and you need to communicate with the workforce really clearly so everybody understands why this is happening, how it's going to be occurring, how it's going to impact them, and then allow genuine opportunity for diversity of thought and feedback, not just tokenistic.
So, do you think we should see more CPOs moving into CEO roles?
Yeah, it's not something you see happen as often, but I think it's absolutely possible because this role sits at the intersection of strategy and risk and culture and execution. So you have that whole of business view. I will say though, to make that transition, I think you have to invest in getting some breadth of experience rather than just the depth. For example, doing time in operations, and ensuring, you've built that commercial acumen and that you have the right network with the customers and the stakeholders for that particular organization.
Amazing. What are you proudest of in your career so far?
Um, I'm probably building the teams that I have and seeing people that didn't necessarily want to be leaders really lean into that space and flourish. I think that's what's made me the proudest, where I've been able to try and pay that debt of mentoring forward,
Yeah.
um, and tell people the things that I wish someone told me at the beginning of my career. That the and not the cliche things, but the secret sauce and the things that are sometimes unpalatable to hear, but you need to know.
The unspoken stuff.
That's right.
Yeah. So, Shomaice, it leads me to the final question I ask everybody, which is what is brave feminine leadership from your perspective, and do you think it needs to change?
So I've got to answer this question in a way that's true to myself, and I definitely associate the concept of brave feminine leadership with my ancestors, particularly the very brave and long-suffering women of Iran, who even today live under enormous oppression, and they still find the courage to speak truth to power, to risk their lives, and to lead revolutions. And
Mm,
I hope one day that we live in a world where everyone can enjoy basic freedoms and human rights. More generally, I don't necessarily see leadership as gendered, and I think gender itself is a social construct. But
mm.
if we associate feminine leadership with empathy and care and connection and courage, then my view is those are qualities that every leader should embody, regardless of their gender.
Yeah. I love that response, and I agree. Showmace, amazing to have you join the conversation and
Thank you.
excited to watch the next steps in your career, whether they be, as you alluded earlier, accidental or whether they be very intentional from here. I think it's going to be exciting to watch. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for having me.